Good evening. We're coming to you tonight from 450 miles north of the Arctic Circle, where warming sea ice is rapidly receding and revealing a new series of opportunities and challenges.
The 8 million square miles of the Arctic is a barren, elemental place, and the windswept land offers little more than a thin blanket of snow. Most of the Arctic is actually a desert, getting roughly the same precipitation as the Great Sahara in Africa. Yet in this barrenness lies beauty. The rugged landscape stretches into the horizon like the canvas of an abstract artist. There are only shapes and colors. The ice has many hues, and the setting sun paints with a full palette. For millennia, hardy indigenous peoples wrested an existence from these waters, and over the last 5 centuries, European and American adventurers tried their luck. Many who made their name here died doing so. They were looking for a direct sea route from the Atlantic to the Pacific, a northwest passage over the American continent that would give Europeans swift access to the riches of the Orient. Their many attempts, however, were frustrated and often crushed by walls of solid ice. For nearly 30 years, satellite images have told the story. The ice cap that sits atop the world is shrinking rapidly, as this NASA animation makes clear. This summer, for the first time in recorded history, because of global warming, melting ice unlocked the passage. This created an open water route that could shave thousands of miles off traditional shipping routes from Europe to Asia. Global warming is upsetting a delicate environmental balance with unpredictable results, but it is also revealing resources that have been locked beneath the ice. Geologists estimate that 25% of the world's untapped oil and natural gas reserves lie in the Arctic. So the Arctic is shaking off its reputation as the end of the world. After all, the Earth is a globe, and the end of the world has always been a matter of perspective. This is how we see the world from North America, how Europeans see it, Africans, and Asians. We put ourselves at the center. But if we return to the globe and travel to the north, you can see a very different type of map. In the middle, the North Pole, the blue of the Arctic Ocean, and its disappearing ice cap. Surrounding it, the 5 Arctic powers, the United States in Alaska, Canada, Denmark, which owns Greenland, Norway, and the largest one of all, Russia. We will explore tonight the many ramifications of this new Arctic environment. But first, we travel to the front lines in the rush to understand what is really going on here. This plucky red ship amidst a sea of ice is the Canadian Coast Guard icebreaker, the Amundsen. It is named for a famed Arctic explorer.
We've talked for centuries about a Northwest Passage. When you look at this map, it looks pretty easy. You just come here and go right straight across.
Yeah.
And you're there.
Yes, but the ice doesn't allow you to go that fast. For many years, it's been always closed in this area, so people couldn't go there.
This is some of the heaviest ice around.
That's right.
Lise Marchand is the captain of the Amundsen.
When I did my first trip in 78 and 79, I mean, it was really packed. It was very hard ice. The conditions aren't the same today.
We traveled on board through the Northwest Passage and the Northern Atlantic for over a week. Despite melting ice, this fickle Arctic environment, where conditions can change in an instant, still requires the security of an icebreaker.
There's 39 crew members on board, which are members of the Coast Guard, and there's 42 science people.
It's mostly a science ship, isn't it?
Well, that's what she's been dedicated for.
The Amundsen is part of an international effort to study the North and South Poles. The ship is a floating laboratory outfitted with high-tech scientific equipment and a variety of odd-looking contraptions, all necessary for conducting cutting-edge research. Almost everyone on board is involved in the experiments, even the captain.
Today, we're part of the survey, because as the ship travels, these instruments are taking the information and recording it to be able to make more accurate charts.
She is navigating the boat in uncharted waters so scientists can measure the ocean's depths.
Question, there are all these little
Numbers,
numerical notations. What are they?
the depth in meters, the depth of water in meters.
The mapping in the Arctic has been pretty sparse in a lot of places.
Doug Cartwright is a scientist mapping the ocean floor in 3 dimensions.
Now we have new technology which allows us to take a complete image of the bottom.
Correct me if I'm wrong, you're able to paint a 3-dimensional picture?
Yes. I mean, some of our images that we just put up for some of our crew when they want to know what we're doing. This is on the edge of the continental margins. This is the shallow area, this is the deep, and you can see all the canyons and valleys.
How does it work? Do you bounce sound waves off of it?
All you do is you send out a sound wave and then wait for the echo to return. It hits the bottom and returns, and you time how long it takes to do that. So we know how fast sound travels in water, and we just time that, and we can figure out how deep it is.
Cartwright is using a device called a multi-beam echo sounder. He says it sends out sound waves in 135 directions to create a more complete picture of the ocean floor.
Do you foresee the day when most of the Arctic floor will be mapped?
It's going to be a long time. Not in my lifetime anyway. So we're going to target areas that are important. Obviously the Northwest Passage is a high priority, and there's certain areas that scientists are more interested in than others.
Simon Belt is one of those scientists.
As well.
He has traveled to the Arctic from England to study chemicals from the ocean floor that he says may be the key to understanding the current dramatic sea ice melt.
We're up here, among other things, to explore the possibility that the historical, almost mythical, Northwest Passage, searched for by explorers for half a millennium, may indeed be open sometime this century. What do you think?
I think that's more than likely. I mean, even in the last few years, all Arctic sea ice records are being broken on almost an annual basis. Given the recent trends, it's certainly tempting to project forward that the Northwest Passage would be open relatively routinely.
At least in the summer, or perhaps even year-round?
Or maybe even year-round. That's more difficult to speculate on. In order to get a better appreciation of the significance of what's happening at the moment, we need to really delve into the past and look to our history, look to the ancestors, and use science to investigate that.
But doing scientific research in the Arctic is not easy. Just getting here is a challenge. Weather conditions are arduous, and conducting experiments in this environment is expensive.
Put that back on. You can just put the camera in there. You're kind of emotionally on a bit of a knife edge quite often because, you know, coming to these remote locations and investing time, financial resources, and knowing that you may, in fact, go away with nothing.
Dr. Belt and his colleagues are measuring key chemical markers found in the sediment on the ocean floor, hundreds of feet beneath the surface. They think these chemicals can reveal the ice conditions from past centuries.
Our objective is to try and test a theory about how we might look at sea ice, historical sea ice, in the past, and use that information to predict where the climate, where the weather is going in the future. What our measure enables us to do is to examine the sea ice composition of the Arctic historically by looking at a fingerprint of the sea ice within the sediments.
The source of those fingerprints is a tiny microorganism that lives in this harsh ecosystem where ice and water meet.
Microorganisms inhabit the ice. They produce a unique chemical, and when the ice melts, the organisms descend through the water column, they enter the sediment, and they release this chemical fingerprint, just like we would have our own fingerprint, which is diagnostic of ourselves. Now, when we examine the presence of this chemical within the sediments, that tells us either the presence or the absence of the sea ice in the past.
Since these microorganisms need sea ice to live, no ice means no microorganisms and no chemical fingerprints. The foundation for Dr. Belch's research is the sediment he dredges from the ocean floor.
And you do that by what? Putting equipment down into the water, pulling
Yes.
up sediment?
We take a box, it's a relatively crude device, but it works extremely well. We lower it over the side of the ship, through the water column, which typically is several hundred meters. And then as it enters the seabed, it plunges down, there's a scoop comes over the bottom to close it, and then we retrieve it.
The box scorer has been deployed, and hopefully, fingers crossed, if you can cross fingers in these gloves, we'll have something around 30 or 40 centimeters depth worth of sediment.
On the Amundsen, there's a tight schedule for the experiments. Dr. Belt has a window of only a few hours to get his sample. And as the box core makes its journey to the bottom of the sea, all he can do is wait and hope.
And here we go, this is a moment of truth. First of all, whether the thing has triggered, which it hasn't.
Unfortunately, the shovel that was supposed to swing closed to capture Dr. Belt's sample failed to deploy. It seems the cables got snagged. With Dr. Belt's experiment window closing,
Repositioning.
he tries again.
Oh yeah, we're gonna have another go, second go of the box core. We need more sensor, you're saying it's not good.
It looks like strike two for Dr. Belt and his team.
The ocean's floor at this point is really dominated by rocks and small pebbles and not very much sediment. For our historical sea ice reconstruction, this will be of no use whatsoever. Okay, let's go around again.
The next night, they try one last time.
The weather is a little inclement. The potential hiccup, I think, will be the fact that it's quite windy, and that makes keeping the ship in one position a little bit more tricky. Hoopla!
Finally, the box core is back on board, and this time, Dr. Belt and his team have reason to smile.
Perfect. Success at last.
Now it's time to dig into the mud that Dr. Belt hopes will provide clues to the changing Arctic.
So we'll take a cylindrical tube, force it down through the sediment, put a cap on the bottom. We can then take that away and do subsequent analysis on it.
Next stop for Dr. Belt and his sediment sample is the onboard laboratory. Each tube of mud is a detailed record of the Arctic's history.
The entire sample's probably 400 to 500 years.
The thick muck on the top is the most recent, and the muck on the bottom is the oldest. Dr. Belt slices off a few millimeters of sediment at a time. Then, with a twist of a knob, pushes up another, older layer. Embedded in each layer of mud are those chemical markers made by the microorganisms living in the sea ice. When he analyzes those markers back on land, Dr. Belt hopes he can determine how much Arctic ice there was in the past.
This corresponds to something in the region 150, 200, maybe 250 years ago, so around the beginning of the Industrial Revolution.
Until now, most scientific knowledge about sea ice melting and freezing comes from satellite images. But satellites only give us information from the past 30 years. Dr. Belt believes his groundbreaking research can take us back much further.
The period of time that realistically we can use this technique for is called the Holocene, which is the last 10,000 years. It's the period since the last ice age.
10,000 years?
Yes.
What Dr. Belt learned may surprise you.
The first results are quite interesting and maybe suggest that what we're experiencing now in terms of the warming and the retreat of the Arctic ice cap may have happened on a number of occasions in the past and relatively frequently.
What does that tell us about the current, quote, global warming? I put it in quotes only because some people insist to put it in quotes.
It's tempting to suggest that man is contributing to this solely and within that there are some small natural fluctuations. I think what's happening is that there are some quite significant natural fluctuations. The man-made effects from the burning of fossil fuels is making a contribution. The difference that we have now compared with the relatively recent past is that with CO2 levels increasing, maybe the natural cycles aren't going to be given the chance to recover to return to the colder periods.
I want to make sure I understand. Your concern now is because of environmental things created by humans, that perhaps nature will not have an opportunity to recover as it did in the past.
That's exactly right.
This is Belcher Glacier. Brad Danielson has been tracking its movements for the past year.
And I have several pieces of equipment installed on this glacier. So the first site
Glaciers across the planet are melting at alarming rates. Danielson wants to get a better idea of the dynamics behind the Arctic glacier melt. Using GPS monitors and time-lapse cameras, Danielson can actually see how quickly the ice is changing.
I had this one taking pictures every 3 hours during the summer. The camera was able to observe the point at which the sea ice broke up and was flushed out into the open water beyond here. In only a matter of a few hours, all of the icebergs that were trapped within the sea ice really began to flush quickly out of here.
Danielson and his crew collect data and switch out some equipment, and then head back to the helicopter. On the return trip to the boat, a rare and special sight. A pod of beluga whales splashes in the shadow of the massive glacier. It's a reminder that this icy place is home to a rich ecosystem. And back on board the Amundsen, scientists are investigating what the animals can tell us about the Arctic. Joanne Delaron works for the Canadian Department of Fisheries and Oceans. Her research starts with samples of the Arctic marine life.
So you collect samples and analyze them.
Right.
Looking for what?
We're looking for organic and inorganic contaminants in the air and in the sediment and in the water, in the biota, in fish, in marine mammals, and how these contaminants eventually move their way up the food chain and affect humans.
And what contaminants do you characteristically find?
Well, we are finding mercury up here in the north, and we're finding some organic contaminants such as HCHs, which is a pesticide.
Pesticides in the Arctic. It may be tough to believe, but Delaron says they are here.
They make their way to the north by the grasshopper effect, it's called. These contaminants will evade into the atmosphere, and then through cold condensation they will fall back down to the ground, once again evade to the atmosphere, and eventually they move their way to the colder environments, and then they are here to stay.
To collect samples, Delaron's team drags huge nets through the water, picking up plankton, sea butterflies, and other marine life. Down in the lab, she sorts the samples by species. Later, she will test the strange creatures for a host of compounds not native to these waters. In addition to mercury and pesticides, she tests for chemicals used in household products, like nonstick coatings, flame retardants, and plastics, too. Delaron says there's reason to worry when these chemicals turn up in the Arctic.
Well, we all have to eat, I think, and ultimately these things work their way up through the food chain to the final people at the top, and that is us.
For now, the frigid Arctic remains remote and intimidating. These beautiful vistas seem far removed from our daily lives. Yet scientists like Dr. Belt say what happens here affects us all, and it is vital that research here continues.
I think there is an urgency for us to carry out both fundamental science and then apply that, because we don't really understand the full significance of these changes. And if we don't do anything about it, then I think potentially we may be too late.
As the geographic landscape shifts, so too does the political landscape. And this fall at the U.S. Capitol, administration officials and flag-rank military officers testified in favor of the U.S. joining a treaty called the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, an agreement that would govern the commerce, environment, and sovereignty of the world's oceans.
As a non-party, we do not have a seat at the table.
More than 150 nations have signed on. The United States has held out for over 2 decades, but the treaty now has wide bipartisan support, and there are hopes that it will finally pass. If so, it will have significant implications for America's rights in the Arctic.
Russia is already making excessive claims in the Arctic. Until we become a party to the convention...
In August, Russia grabbed the world's attention when submarines planted a titanium Russian flag on the Arctic seabed, 14,000 feet beneath the surface. That gesture carried no legal weight, but it highlighted an important aspect of the Law of the Sea Treaty governing the continental shelf. A continental shelf is the part of a continent that stretches underwater. According to the Law of the Sea, if a country maps a shelf from its shores and can convince a panel of scientists of the map's accuracy, it can claim that part of the ocean as its territory. Deputy Secretary of State John Negroponte.
The United States stands to secure resource rights over one of the largest continental shelves in the world.
Controlling the continental shelf means controlling the potential natural resources that, with the ice melting, are now more accessible. Norway is already drilling for Arctic natural gas. We traveled to Barrow, Alaska, the northernmost tip of the United States. Just offshore, the U.S. Coast Guard icebreaker Healy returned from mapping American claims in the Arctic.
We spent 30 days mapping this area.
Tedrick Lindstrom is the Healy's captain. His ship is devoted to Arctic research, which includes mapping the ocean floor.
It's important to know the features of the bottom here because there's different ways you can claim a continental shelf in accordance with the law of the sea.
The Healy is America's only fully functional icebreaker, something its captain acknowledges is undoubtedly a problem.
We're going to need to tend to increasing or working on the fleet of Coast Guard icebreakers. It just takes a long time to build a new icebreaker, and we probably should be starting on that soon.
We once had a rather robust fleet of icebreakers. That has been allowed to dwindle into what I would call a very geriatric and moribund few.
Former Coast Guard officer Dr. Scott Borgerson is now a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. What are the challenges facing the United States in developing an icebreaker fleet?
Physically building icebreakers. We don't build them very often. Today, most Arctic-capable vessels and icebreakers are built in the Scandinavian countries and in Russia, and I'm not sure, have the capability to build one if we wanted to.
All right, so you said the first thing is, can we build it?
Can we build it? And the second question is, do we want to? And at the moment, with Iraq and Afghanistan and North Korea and Iran, I think the Arctic is near the bottom of the priority list.
We have Alaska. We are an Arctic-facing nation. True?
I think we're an Arctic-facing nation. I would be surprised if many in Washington, D.C. would agree with that statement.
Is or is not the United States of America prepared for the new rush for influence, resources, and power in the Arctic?
We are not prepared. We're not prepared because we don't have the vessels to operate there. We're not prepared because we've not signed the treaty that gives us legal standing to participate in the diplomatic discussions. We've not confronted and faced up to the reality of climate change in the Arctic. Not many Americans, I think, appreciate the huge stakes that exist in the Arctic region. I would say we're not prepared at all.
When the Russians went and planted the flag, if you will,
yes,
what was your immediate reaction to that?
It was purely symbolic and ceremonial, and I thought, honestly, a little silly. And then my second reaction was, thank you. Maybe now the United States and other countries will start to take notice of the melting Arctic ice cap and all of the geopolitical issues that are attendant to that. The United States has failed to awaken to the implications and grand significance of climate change. But maybe ultimately being left in the wake of other countries who are moving ahead into the Arctic will awaken this country to get its act together.
We see what's happening in the Arctic. We see the opening of the Northwest Passage.
U.S. Navy Admiral John Morgan is Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Information, Plans, and Strategy. In mid-October, the Navy, Coast Guard, and Marines issued the Cooperative Strategy for 21st Century Sea Power. It's a broad outline with only a passing mention of the Arctic. The report says sea power should be used to keep trade open and to prevent war.
We're going to elevate the notion of the prevention of war. We're looking at a doctrine of anticipatory engagement, sort of trying to peek around that corner as best we can.
When you take the hard looks at anticipating what's ahead, if I say to you, I'm willing to bet you, Admiral, that one of the new hotspots will be the Arctic.
I'd say I think your bet is exactly right. I don't think it's going to become a hotspot. I think it's going to be a key area of interest. It's going to be an important strategic area for the globe.
But the report is short on specific needs, like icebreakers. Currently, the two most powerful U.S. Coast Guard icebreakers are on their last legs, and the Navy doesn't have any. By contrast, the Russians have about 20. But Admiral Morgan, who said icebreaking has not been the Navy's responsibility, told us he wasn't sure of the exact numbers of either the U.S. or Russian icebreaking fleets.
I guess I'm not accustomed to looking at it in terms of a purely competitive advantage. I'm not familiar with the operations the Russians are doing with their icebreakers, and probably a Coast Guard admiral would be better suited to answer those questions for you.
But as a Navy man, surely you can see that if we want to have our Navy and the Coast Guard be an extension of power when necessary in the Arctic region, it would seem elemental that we've got to have more icebreakers.
Well, we continually reassess our capability requirements. With this development, which we factor into our strategy, we then try to use the strategic insight to help inform our budgetary choices. Where do we make large capital investments? Can we rely on our friends? Can we turn to the Canadians and say, can we rely upon Canadian icebreakers to meet our needs?
Relatively to what this country spends on the war in Iraq, which is very expensive, of course, or the amount we spend to support our Navy and our Army and our Air Force, which should be supported, we're spending relatively next to nothing on the Arctic. And certainly we're spending next to nothing on icebreakers.
I spoke to U.S. Navy Vice Admiral John Morgan. Now, he told me that the U.S. Navy had no icebreakers. He had no idea how many icebreakers the Russians possessed or what kind of operations they were involved in. Is that a problem, would you say?
Yes. Climate change is happening so fast. The Arctic Ocean is becoming a water basin connected to this larger one world ocean, and I think should figure very prominently into the naval maritime strategy.
This new U.S. strategy is also silent on a key disagreement between the United States and Canada: sovereignty over the Northwest Passage. The Canadians say the passage clearly passes between their islands and therefore constitutes territorial waters. The United States views the passage as international straits, like those of Gibraltar, and says there should be free passage for ships sailing under any flag.
These two opposing positions, while they seem quite dramatically opposed, were not a serious problem because the ice, the thick, hard, multi-year ice, prevented any significant traffic from other countries arriving there.
Michael Byers is a professor of politics at the University of British Columbia, specializing in U.S.-Canada relations. In 1985, a U.S. icebreaker, the Polar Sea, went through the Northwest Passage without Canadian permission, cooling relations between the two countries. An agreement a couple of years later patched things up, but as the Arctic melts, so too does that framework.
The United States has argued that the Northwest Passage is an international strait open to ships from any country, knowing full well that ships from every country would not come. But now they have a scenario where ships from North Korea or from Iran or carrying Panamanian flags and Filipino crews and potentially owned by Al-Qaeda could arrive. And the argument that this is an international strait open to everyone starts to carry some downside risks. As for the Canadian position, that these are Canadian internal waters, if there's thick, hard ice, you don't have to do anything to protect, to assert that claim. If the ice disappears, then all of a sudden claiming that these are your waters entails a pretty significant responsibility to provide a policing capacity.
Currently, only Canadian Coast Guard icebreakers like the Amundsen patrol the Northwest Passage. But this summer, Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper announced a more muscular approach to protecting what he calls Canadian sovereignty.
This is Nunavut, an abandoned mining village, now a fuel stop for Canadian icebreakers. It may soon become an essential piece of Canada's claim to the Arctic.
Harper came here in August to say he will spend millions of dollars to turn this outpost into a deep-water port for military and civilian vessels.
The whole idea of having a facility in Nunavut will really enhance our ability to project forces up into the north.
Canada's Brigadier General Chris Whitecross's command stretches across the Canadian Arctic.
That's 40% of Canada's landmass and about 75% of Canada's coastal waters. Very pristine environment, pollution-free, but vast. Absolutely huge.
Under Prime Minister Harper's plans, the small town of Resolute Bay would house a cold-weather military training center.
We have to learn to live in an environment and to operate into an environment that is very different than what we're used to in the South. It does get particularly cold, and the wind chill factors can range anywhere between minus 60 to even minus 80 or minus 90 degrees Celsius. And it's not a matter of giving that guy a parka, a good pair of boots, pair of mitts, and a hat and said, go up north and operate. And the ideals behind the Arctic Training Center is to develop a military cadre from the South that are capable of operating in the North because they have this training. The ability to project military forces into the North in case of a contingency are pretty important.
Prime Minister Harper announced Canada would build 6 to 8 new naval Arctic patrol boats. But some within Canada's government think that plan to militarize the Arctic goes too far.
I see very little need to project force in the Northwest Passage.
Colin Kenny heads the Defense Committee in Canada's Senate.
The idea of us going up with an armed vessel and saying to the Americans, stop, you can't cross, or to the Russians, niet, you can't come, isn't going to happen. Sovereignty is not achieved through military force. And at the end of the day, issues of sovereignty in the North are going to be resolved by lawyers and diplomats sitting around a table and bartering off square kilometers with each other.
I'm not worried about the Northwest Passage as a location for military conflict.
Professor Byers has other concerns.
The most important challenge is actually the environmental risks that come from having unregulated international shipping traffic through a fragile ecosystem. An oil spill in the Northwest Passage would cause destruction for hundreds of years.
Byers believes environmental concerns will prevent large-scale extraction of Arctic natural resources. But he says policing this vast region will mean also confronting security threats.
Canada has the longest coastline of any country in the world, and most of it is in the Arctic. And as the amount of activity increases, foreign vessels coming from just about anywhere could bring drugs, guns, illegal immigrants into North America. Once you're into northern Canada, it's relatively easy to get to southern Canada and then potentially on into the United States.
Byers thinks Canadian sovereignty should govern the Northwest Passage and its Coast Guard should patrol these waters while allowing other countries to use it. But U.S. Navy Admiral John Morgan says that the Northwest Passage should be considered international waters.
We are accustomed that we have the right of innocent passage, and I can't foresee the day that right of innocent passage through the Northwest Passage would be changed. I think the opening of the Northwest Passage is akin to the opening of the Suez Canal, or perhaps even the Panama Canal.
But there are critics who question whether large-scale shipping operations through the Northwest Passage are really feasible.
They give me a version of this. Dan Rather, don't fall for this idea that we're going to have the Northwest Passage open even for 4 months of the summer for significant tanker, freighter, passenger traffic. Isn't going to happen. Your response to that?
Well, I would agree with urging some caution about when it will happen. Insurance markets have not caught up yet with how one might insure ships transiting there regularly. That is something that will have to be worked out. Right now, I think the insurance is probably too expensive. You have to design ships and train crews with special Arctic capabilities. That's more expensive as well. But it's on average for some ports to ports in the Pacific Atlantic 5,000 nautical miles shorter. So even if you have to build a more expensive ship and the insurance markets have to figure it out, at some point it's not a matter of if, but when that becomes a reality. But I would challenge the viewers of this program to open an atlas and to rethink their mental maps about how they imagine their world, their neighborhood, their country, the place of the United States in that world, to be leading not just on climate change, but on diplomatic solutions and statecraft of great American tradition of how to manage this new frontier, this new region that before was irrelevant and is now thawing into what could be a Wild West, or what I hope, if America gets its act together, and the Arctic in particular, and the climate change issue more broadly, a leadership position to be at the front on this issue.
The one thing I've learned in studying the Northwest Passage is that all bets usually are off.
Introduce ourselves to this big fellow.
We sat down with maritime archaeologist and historian James Delgado at the Explorers Club in New York City to discuss the history of the Northwest Passage.
The dream of navigators and nations of 4 to 5 centuries past will come true, with the Northwest Passage being one of the great oceanic routes of the world. What's unfortunate with that is that perhaps the tales of what that once was, how it was a passage won with toil and with blood, will be forgotten as it just becomes just another way to go.
After Columbus's voyage in 1492, Spain monopolized the sea routes to the New World. With the Pope's blessing, Spain also controlled most of the New World's lands. This left the rest of Europe looking for other ways to reach the Orient.
The Northwest Passage was the holy grail for European powers because this was the key, not only to riches, but ultimately to power. A Northwest Passage, there was no other way. Every other door was closed.
With the support of King Henry VII of England, John Cabot made the first recorded attempt to find the waters of the Northwest Passage, which he believed would lead to the riches of the Far East.
But it wasn't until the voyages of Martin Frobisher, beginning in 1576, that the English first reached the Arctic and realized that perhaps this was the way in. Martin Frobisher is one of those typical English sea dogs of the 16th century. Hardy, tough, bluff, willing to fight. And I think this tells you a great deal about the man. The English knew about the Esquimaux, as they were known, but they'd never really seen one come back. A kayak approached Frobisher's ship on his voyage, and this man, big, burly, and strong, leaned down to grasp this man and give him a trinket, and instead hauled him and his kayak up onto the deck of his ship, captured him, and took him back to England.
Alive.
Alive. That's the kind of guy Martin Frobisher was.
Henry Hudson, arguably the best known of the early explorers. Who was he? What did he do?
Henry Hudson is an English merchant and adventurer. Frobisher had talked about a strait that he had seen, approached and turned away from. Hudson thought that perhaps that was the way in. Ultimately, Hudson would push into that strait and find that it was not the entrance to the Northwest Passage, but Hudson's Bay. On a voyage that ended farther south, he pushed up a river and, of course, passed the site of modern-day New York City. The final voyage of Henry Hudson has Hudson go into Hudson Bay, probe it a bit, and then get caught by the winter. The men ultimately mutiny, and a handful of those, including Hudson's own son, who are loyal to the explorer, are placed into a boat with Henry Hudson and set adrift, marooned, never to be seen again. Henry Hudson, like many Arctic explorers, vanishes into the mist, and his tale is yet not completely told.
By the time of the American Revolution, both eastern and western entrances to the Northwest Passage had been sighted, but their significance was not truly understood. Decades of war would consume Britain's time and resources, and ultimately little was left for Arctic exploration. But when those wars ended, John Barrow, Secretary of the Admiralty, saw a way to keep the Royal Navy busy.
In 1818, Barrow sends John Ross with a few ships up into Baffin Bay, and Ross goes in, skirts the coast of Greenland, pushes very far north, comes back down, recharts Baffin's Bay, but he doesn't do his job because he sees an entrance. His officers say, "Sir, look, That's got to be it. And he says, I see no entrance. It's an optical illusion. I see mountains. Well, there were no mountains. And Barrow was furious. He figured that Ross was either a coward or a fool, and so he relieved him of any future responsibility ever going there and turned to one of his younger lieutenants, Edward Perry, and said, you sailed there. Perry sails and enters the Arctic in 1819 and goes almost through. He would have been the first guy through the Northwest Passage. The quest would have been over in 1820, but he's stopped by the ice.
He's that close.
He is that close. He stops, winters in at a spot called Winter Harbor. They carve their names on a huge rock. He turns back, and what follows then are a series of other voyages by other explorers, which ultimately end in death and disaster and paint a picture of the Arctic as a dreadful, weird, and tragic land, as one newspaper editorial of the mid-19th century would term it.
Well, let's talk about the men who actually sailed on the ships and did the exploring. What kind of men were they? Who were they?
There's an oft-repeated, perhaps cliché phrase that this was an age of wooden ships and iron men. And certainly the type of individual that would go out in quest for a Northwest Passage or reach the far seas was a very hearty and determined individual. Most of these men did not return. Most didn't succumb to the effects of ice. Many men died of scurvy or other diseases. Shipboard hygiene was terrible. Rats lived in the bilges, and the men tolerated it because on prolonged voyages, those rats were the only source of fresh meat that they had. Water, packed in casks, would grow green and slimy. Rope would freeze solid. Your bare skin touching metal would burn and leave flesh and skin sticking to it. Cold wind would whip up. Men would become hypothermic. It certainly was not an ideal set of conditions.
Perhaps the most famous and best equipped explorer was John Franklin.
John Franklin is one of the most incredible figures in the history of Arctic exploration. The man was no fool, and yet perhaps he was. He was a man of some ambition. He was a man who certainly was brave, but he was also a man who lived within the box.
Sir John Franklin would travel to the region several times, but it was his fateful fourth journey in 1845 that etched his name in Arctic lore.
This was Britain's technological, scientific, and military prowess. 2 ships, Erebus and Terror, outfitted with modern conveniences, including 2 steam railroad engines lifted off of street railways and put into the holds and linked up to propellers were going to give the mode of steam to push him through. They were also going to provide insulation and heat for the men. The newest conveniences such as canned food were going to be there so the men didn't have to hunt. Modern winterproof clothing, a library of over 2,000 books, a Daguerrean photographic apparatus, even Jocko the pet monkey, all fitted into the holds of these 2 ships, and it was going to be a cakewalk. They were going to push through in a season or 2, and what makes them ultimately all the more famous is for all of that, they died to the last man. They overwhelmed the Arctic. They couldn't power their way through in these wooden ships. They could have done it in a smaller vessel, but instead they send these big ships in that get stuck in the ice.
What happened to Franklin and his crew in this vast wilderness remains one of the Arctic's most haunting mysteries.
After all of this bravery, foolhardiness, some of it, finally some European finds a Northwest Passage.
The man who ultimately will trace the Northwest Passage is a Norwegian by the name of Roald Asbjørn Amundsen. Amundsen had grown up thrilling to the tales of Franklin and his sacrifice. He had a romantic personality.
Saw himself as a kind of knight of the Arctic.
Absolutely. I mean, Franklin, Sir John, is certainly a knight who dies on the quest for the Grail of the Arctic. Amundsen, as a Norwegian, will pick it up.
In great contrast to Franklin, Amundsen, in the early 20th century, went in small, in a single fishing sloop, the Joa, with a crew of only 6 men. Rather than attempting to tame the Arctic, Amundsen planned to learn from the environment as he traversed the treacherous waters of the Northwest Passage.
The local Inuit approach him. They talk to Amundsen. He winters with them, charts the magnetic North Pole, makes friends, and then moves on. Goes all the way through, wends his way up. Now coming close to the border of Alaska, he finally spots a ship. It's an American whaler, the Charles Hanson out of San Francisco.
He's made it.
He's made it. He said tears come to his eyes. And ultimately, Yoa is beached on Ocean Beach at the foot of Golden Gate Park in San Francisco, presented as a gift to the people of the city at the termination of the voyage. And Amundsen is a hero, world-famous adventurer who will now go on to conquer other horizons.
First European to make it through the Northwest Passage.
Roald Amundsen is the first European to make it through. The most amazing thing about the entire story of the quest for the Northwest Passage is that the true conquerors of the Northwest Passage were not the British explorers, they weren't Roald Amundsen and his men. Actually, they were the indigenous people who lived there, the Inuit or the Eskimos. They lived understanding the tenuous balance of life in the North. They adapted by building houses made of snow. They adapted by taking bone and fastening it into implements in a wood-starved land. They adapted by eating raw seal and raw fish to get their vitamin C. They adapted to the harsh light of the Arctic by carving goggles made of wood with tiny slits so they wouldn't go snowblind. They were the true conquerors of the Northwest Passage. But of course, they never had any reason to sail from one end to the other.
Arctic Bay and its 700 residents cling to the frigid, rocky coast. This is one of a handful of villages dotting Canada's Arctic expanse.
The tiny hamlet is about 1,000 miles north of the nearest trees, and it's cold. In January, the temperature can drop to 30 degrees below zero, and in July, it barely climbs above freezing. It's a difficult place to survive, and yet people have thrived here for millennia. They are the Inuit. The word means simply people, and about 150,000 Inuit now live in Canada, Greenland, Alaska, and Russia. Traditionally, their survival depended heavily on the sea ice. Their way of life, an early casualty of global warming.
Now, what direction were you born, this way or this way?
We met Kiguk and her nephew, Mishak Alarut. They are Inuit. She told us the world of her childhood has all but disappeared.
Tell me, what has changed in your lifetime?
Nuna, imakdo asijir simayo kauyimayak. Kauyimadaw ninili manna sigjaw kiglinga kwagaro duadong man taw ko aw matjakto. Natiloni kisingit tukunak sa sungura ko lang mata taw na imaniglinit yakiligo. Manna niglinit yang ilang ngano natti kisingit nakungit sa tukurunak sa katadok ilangin.
We depend upon the snow on the ice, and the melting of the planet, we're witnessing it first.
Inuit advocate Sheila Watt-Cloutier says her people have long witnessed changes to which the rest of the world is only now awakening.
Nowhere else in the world does ice and snow represent mobility and transportation as it does for us. The moment this land turns to snow and that water turns to ice, it becomes our highways. And that's where we travel to, our supermarkets, which is out there, the bounty of the land and the ice. And it's absolutely a part of our hunting culture. If the ice is forming a lot thinner, then it becomes a dangerous situation.
Watt-Cloutier says over the centuries, the Inuit had learned to read the ice. They used to know just by looking, but no longer.
Even our most seasoned hunters have difficulty reading even the condition of the ice when it forms. What you see on the top is not necessarily what you have always known underneath.
Inuit hunters are now finding themselves in deadly situations, falling through thinning ice, or being set adrift on ice floes by ice-breaking ships. A loss of hunting ice leads to a loss of culture. Learning to hunt is an important rite of passage in Arctic communities, a rite we saw handed down from one generation to another. Sea ice typically freezes in early October. When we visited at the end of September, there was only water. We would be hunting aboard a boat, not a sled.
The hunting culture is not just the killing of animals. It's about teaching our young people how to be bold under pressure. It's to build their character skills as you're out there on the land, how to withstand stress, how to be courageous, how to be patient. how to have sound judgment, how not to be impulsive. All of those things are so very necessary for a transitioning culture like ours.
This is a complex culture built around a freezing and melting sea. The Inuits' ancestors were nomadic people from Alaska who fanned out across the Arctic about 5,000 years ago. The Vikings were likely the first Westerners the Inuit met around 1200 AD, but the Vikings didn't stay long. Then, in the early 19th century, European explorers searching for the Northwest Passage brought disease and prejudices to the Arctic. Like their Native American neighbors to the south, the Inuit lost entire communities to measles and smallpox. The ones who survived were exploited. After World War II, the Canadian government encouraged the Inuit to abandon their nomadic life and settle in government-built towns like Arctic Bay. Much of the traditional life of the Inuit is disappearing. Unemployment rates are high, and most Inuit rely on public assistance. High suicide rates, teenage pregnancy, and drug addiction are widespread problems. The older Inuit look at the opening of the Northwest Passage and the potential economic boom it could bring with mixed feelings.
If they discover the great oil that they believe is here, would it help the Inuit?
Ikayo tau gajang majugoro ilanga ikayo tau yunaro gajang imingman ilanga ikayo tau gajak tunaro nang itugoro kisane pilgoruk tukanapan imang meutani nyakililo agaro gota tamanang meutigut tamanna isamado na lakik kajakto.
You can imagine how many countries and ships would be coming through there and then playing havoc with the migration of the whales and the fish and the seals, and the potential to have terrible oil spills. And
Inuit advocate Sheila Watt-Cloutier says the Inuit worry if regulations are not put in place and enforced, the damage could be catastrophic. But as control of the Arctic has turned into an international squabble, the Inuit are fighting for a place at the table.
We have been trying to pressure our own government to assert its sovereignty so that we Inuit who live up here can at least be in some control of managing some of this change that's going to happen with the opening of the Northwest Passage. It would be really beneficial for the government of Canada and any other governments who are interested in protecting the Arctic's environment to start to set up some really powerful research centers and use our hunters for their wisdom and for their traditional knowledge.
One way the Canadian government has historically involved the Inuit is the Rangers program. About 4,000 Inuit carry light arms and ammunition and patrol the Arctic watching for suspicious activity or unfamiliar boats. They help establish Canadian sovereignty in the region, and Canada's Prime Minister has announced he wants to increase their ranks substantially. As the Arctic warms and more people move north, the small Inuit communities know the best chance they have to protect themselves and their valuable hunting grounds is to cooperate with governments and oil and gas companies. But that goodwill should go both ways.
We have a lot to offer. Tap into us. Tap into the strength, the resilience, the wisdom of Inuit. Whatever is happening to the planet happens here first, and if you want to take the pulse of the planet, come to the Arctic and feel its pulse, and you'll know how healthy the planet is.
Taking the pulse of the Arctic means studying it, appreciating its vulnerabilities. Most of us spend little time thinking about this icy land, and it used to be that our collective ignorance wasn't much of a problem. But now, as the ice melts, that is no longer the case.
The Arctic is a magical world, undergoing radical change. And you can't be here and not think that we as humans should do more to protect and preserve this northern region in order to safeguard our planet and its continued well-being. From the Arctic, for HDNet, Dan Rather reported. Good night. If you have questions or comments, send us an email. The address is viewer@hd.net.